Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to Highlights on the Book of Action and Reaction. You're joined again by Kirsten DeMello and
Xavier.
We give highlights on this book on Chapter 5, and it is entitled Sickly Souls. Leo, last video we made was about Chapter 4. It was about Chapter 4 that was entitled The Newly Discarnates, right? And we learned that those newly discarnates, they weren't in such a bad condition as some cases we're going to review in this particular chapter, which is interesting. But this chapter starts out with, already we know that Chapter 4, those newly discarnates, when they came back to the spirit realm, they were helped and they were assisted by family members, people who cared about them, because they didn't live a life that they had attracted such negativity towards them and didn't leave them in such a deplorable state once they discarnated. But in Chapter 5, we find ourselves in a different part of Mansal Paz. Up until now, we've been dealing with inside Mansal Paz, but Chapter 5 that entails Sickly Souls, which is very significant. They basically entail sort of a cases that go on behind, sort of like the backyard of Mansal Paz or Peace Mansion, and that's where this interesting rescue work
is happening outside.
It's happening there, and the dynamics of it, because it's run by a man, and you're gonna you know more about this, the dynamics of how this rescue work.
That is correct. The report is that we get in this chapter as they develop this idea on the works of the need of understanding more the cause and effect, the idea of cause and effect with these minds, the sickly souls. They're bringing this backyard of Mansal Paz now, where they're outside and they're dealing with the newly discarnated or suffering spirits. And they were in this very deplorable situation. Mm-hmm. As they're walking to this location where they will meet a man called Orzo, who in fact was someone who was also brought to Mansal Paz in his suffering state, and through work now, through the idea of helping others,
he rehabilitated himself.
He's rehabilitating himself.
Yeah.
He's actually getting better through the work, and it's very beautiful, this idea of work. As you rehabilitate yourself through work, it's very interesting.
As a form of rehabilitation.
Exactly, and they're getting to the location where they will analyze the 3 cases which we'll see. But it's interesting that this man, they mentioned that he's really huge. He's to have this
like a
bear-looking body, and he's also accompanied by 6 dogs. Mm-hmm. And some of the dogs are actually to maintain the peace and the location in order from these sickly minds that are attacking, that are in a very deplorable state. But as they walking through and they are sitting down, and Orzo is asked by Silas, so how's everything? And he said, well, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to be done. We just had 3 sickly souls brought by the storm that had happened the night before. And they start explaining, and they start walking to the locations where they come in contact with these sickly souls.
The storm they're referring to is back in Chapter 1. We think it's so far away because it's Chapter 1, but actually all this is taking place probably in a matter of what we may consider days.
Correct.
Right? So the storm in Chapter 1 where they, if we could just digress back a little bit, where there's like this windstorm, tornado of souls that are being pushed around outside of Mansal Paz, and that's at which time Andre Luiz and Hilario, they're astonished when they look outside, and it's not a storm of cars and twigs, but of human souls, of spirits
They're suffering
that are suffering, and through their suffering and through their anguish, and also through all the negative energies that they've sort of spewed around them, it just causes a windstorm.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because they, Orzo and probably other workers as well were able to help these 3 and bring them into what's sort of like a cell.
It is like a cell. They as they're walking towards this location, they come in contact with this first soul, with this first sickly mind. And his name is Vega, and they get into there and they start analyzing the whole thing. And what they see a man who is still suffering from his mental creations, like the other ones also, we're going to touch on that, from his mental creations, from what he's still longing from life, from the incarnated life, where he was still struggling with the power that he had, with the money that he had, that now he claims that his son had taken from him. Again, the materialistic mind suffering from his own mental creation. It's very deplorable because he shows himself not in a state where I need help, but he's very rebellious. He's very rebellious towards the sons and asking other negative minds to pretty much persecute his sons.
Yeah. It's interesting, Leo, if we could comment as well, the emotion, the anger that he feels, because sometimes we think about parents and the way that Andre Luiz depicts the story is pretty horrific and sad. Like you said, he's in a deplorable state in this little makeshift cell behind Mansell Pass that he's being taken care of by Orzo, who's this redemptive soul. So it's interesting because sometimes we think about parents, we think, well, parents love their children. Well, in this particular case, his father is so angry and so upset. It's ironic because he himself sort of helped to generate the situation that he's now living, which rings true for the law of cause and effect. And that reaction that he has is not unlike many reactions that many of us have. When we create our own circumstances, because indeed we do, we then cry and call God unjust, or say the situations are unjust, but according to the law of cause and effect, justice always prevails. God's laws, they never falter, which is, we would say, is one of the most difficult concepts in Spiritism and in other religious aspects. The law of, some may refer to as karma or cause and effect in other arenas. It's a difficult concept because we look at the horrific things that happen to us in life and tragedies, but we know that God's justice never fails. You know, that the murderer of yesterday comes back today to redeem himself.
Correct. It's interesting because it touches on a very important point, our responsibility towards ourselves.
Yes.
Because Silas explains here that they are there because of their mental creations, because of themselves. They have brought themselves to this suffering. And they, quite frankly, they need this moment of repentance, reflection in order for them to get out of that. That's what's gonna actually help them earn the ability to get out of that state. But there's another, the second case, which is very interesting as well, which is a man who is suffering because of his situation, having actually killed someone in his previous reincarnation. He's still suffering. Talk about a little bit more about that.
It's really interesting, Leo. It's the case that this particular man, he had killed someone, and by all what it appears, according to the book, is that nobody saw what he did, and they say he was not jailed, probably because they say the human justice pretty much didn't catch him. He didn't suffer. It didn't apply to him. Perhaps he killed somebody and got away with it. But his own conscience was so strong that when they approached his cell, and Silas and Andre Luiz and Hilario were observing him, he was interesting because he was downtrodden, and they could see this zone of remorse. But when Silas called his attention, he leaped at them, and the only reason that he didn't probably hit them in their face or, hurt them is because there were physical bars, like jail bars. But it's interesting because we talk about this, mental force that we have, our thoughts, the power that we have, the mental creations. He was stuck in the same mental creations, the image of the murder that he created, or that he did, was sort of running like a loop over and over in his mind. It's interesting because
you brought a very interesting concept, the fact that they are discarnated, they're in the spirit realm, and we're talking about bars, we're talking about being incarcerated, which is a blessing in their state, because otherwise they would be aggravating their situation even further.
Causing more harm.
Exactly, if they're not contained that way. But it's beautiful that you mentioned this, which brings us to the third case, which in this case was a man who actually was a very, let's say, a person who didn't do much at all.
Silas calls him a habitual idler.
Habitual idler, exactly, who actually engaged himself with women at the brothel, and he was actually, his alibi, if we can call it that way, was that he was there to help the women. He was there just to kind of, protect them, and he didn't do anything. He was
their savior.
And it's interesting because they also mention how he presented himself, picking his own wounds, right? The pus coming out and all those different things. And again, they're presenting this, and they're in the spirit realm, and he claims that the disease that he has was actually he contracted from one of the women.
Right.
So it's interesting that we see all these things in the spirit realm, but what's going on here? Like you said, the power of our minds. So
as
we think
Silas says, yes.
the thing that we can point out here the most is the fact that they're in the spirit realm and they're all go through their suffering. They're living their lives as if they were here because of their power of their thoughts.
And Leo, one thing we wanted to point out, because Silas actually says, and permit me to quote from page 66, mental creations weigh fatalistically in our lives. And Leo, that's interesting because it encompasses so much. So for instance, we can take the case of the man who worked in the brothel. He probably had those type of thought patterns already, that maybe he liked it, he enjoyed it, so he cultivated those thought patterns. So, well, it's something he enjoyed, why should he have to change it? So we see oftentimes in our lives, why is it so difficult to change a habit, to change a thought pattern? Because it's a habit. We form habits. It's habitual in nature. Even Silas calls him this habitual idler because he's used to just sort of being a sloth. And we don't say this in a judgmental way because we know they don't bring these cases in a judgmental way. But for us, reading these cases to be more aware of our thoughts, of our mental life, Leo, and that's probably one of the things we want people to walk away from this chapter, is know what type of mental life you are cultivating inside of yourself, and also teach your children how to cultivate a healthy mental attitude about themselves and about others.
Right. And here's the $1 million question. How will they come out of the situation? As we see here, we get the explanation from Silas saying they were there because they are creating this own world around them or for themselves, or they have cultivated it throughout that last reincarnation.
Right.
And we see how will they come out of this living suffering, we can say that way, mainly by changing their thought. Mainly changing their feelings. And the same thing we call one another here. Spiritism calls us to change our feelings towards one another. If we have a problem, whether we brought from the past, whether it's something that has generated in a difficult moment in our lives now, let's treat it. Let's find out, what kind of feeling do I have? And agree to that, okay, I don't feel good about this, but what can I do to change it? How am I going to change this? How am I going to take the next step not to suffer anymore? Because if we run from it, later on, it's going to come and haunt us very badly.
And we learn this in this chapter, that we really reap what we sow, and that is what they start out. Silas starts out talking about, the principles of law of cause and effect. So that would also be something we want to take away from this, is that learn about your mental life, cultivate positive attitude, positive thoughts. If you don't even know, I'm not sure what's negative, create a diary for yourself of what type of thoughts you have, what type of feelings you have throughout the day. But don't forget, as Joanna DeAngelis teaches us in the book, Family Constellation, to educate your children, to be transparent to your children, that we are also human, right? Meaning that we are not infallible. We can make errors and mistakes, but we can always begin again. What's past is past. We need to cultivate today what is most important. And that would be part of our takeaway today, dear friends. And we wish you many blessings. Until next time.
Thank you.